Thank you very much, and thank you, the organizers, for giving me this opportunity to give a presentation of Historians Without Borders and on the agenda, because this is one thing which is, we have noted, is very sorely lacking when discussing contemporary problems, and the knowledge of history is diminishing rather than increasing. And of course, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy has been very supportive of our work, and we are looking forward to continuing this cooperation. So we are living in increasingly ahistorical times, and by this I mean that people's awareness and knowledge and understanding of from where and how we have arrived where we are today is diminishing rather than increasing. And a complaint one hears from historians from almost everywhere today is that history is being downgraded in school curricula and examination criteria. And one consequence of this ignorance is that it also weakens our ability to see into the future and shape it, fostering what is sometimes called now as postmodern here and now short-termism. To assert that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it may or may not be true, but ignorance will always increase the risk of becoming an unconscious prisoner of history and prey to the machinations of politicians seeking to exploit history for their own ends and purposes. History and politics have always been intertwined, even if the links have not always been recognized. And these links and the use and abuse of history for political ends are much older than the concept of politics of history, for which there is, I don't think, any commonly agreed definition as yet. One could give precedence for the concept to Germany, where the roots of politics of history lead. Research into the politics of history seeks to delve into history debates and is interested in everything that comes under the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. There are very few languages, in addition to Finnish, in which this German term is easily translated with a single word. In Finnish, it's menneisyyden hallinta. It does not mean, of course, the management of history in the sense of manipulating it, but on the contrary refers to addressing one's history honestly with an open mind and coming to terms with it, warts and all, including the unsavory parts of your own history. And in this respect, Germany provides the best model for dealing openly with the most challenging and awful periods of its own history. The list of countries who have achieved anything close to this frankness with their own history is very short compared to the long list of countries where this has not been possible and where attempts to do so have been rejected. A positive example could be post-apartheid South Africa with its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it is already a completely different case with Austria, which shares to a great extent its 20th century history with neighboring Germany, and which has, with a little help from Hollywood, and I'm thinking of Sound of Music, to make itself into a victim of National Socialism and avoid confronting its own past. The list of bad and even frightening examples is long. The worst example of this is present-day Russia. The phenomenon is nothing new in the country where both Tsarist and Bolshevik leaders have always used officially sanctioned versions of the country's history to justify their actions and politics. It can be argued that this abuse of history has reached unprecedented heights under Putin, starting with his notorious article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which was published in July 2021, and which sought to deny the existence of any Ukrainian and Belarusian identity separate from that of Russia, and glorified Russia's exceptionalism and its past. Bad and mendacious historiography is distasteful and should be vigorously criticized, but it reaches totally new dimensions when any dissent from it is policed and controlled by legislative and administrative measures, where any critique can lead to severe punitive consequences. And still worse is, of course, using distorted history as an excuse for making war. Among the new amendments to the Russian constitution is one which criminalizes diminishing the accomplishments of the, quote, defenders of the fatherland, unquote, and their role in World War II. This vague wording, plus a host of lesser legislation, is sufficient to give the authorities wide powers to imprison anyone who engages in criticism of the officially approved Putinist version of Russian history. Although not new, this kind of abuse of history has not always been predominant. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a brief period when the Russian government was ready to openly admit Soviet responsibility, for example, for the mass murders in Katyn, and was ready to honor the victims of Stalinism in a joint commemoration with the Polish leaders. And there was also a brief period when Russian historical archives were more or less open to all scholars and researchers. This Russian openness, brief openness, was an important and real breakthrough for building historical understanding across borders, which, because of the tragic death of the President of Poland in the Smolensk air crash on his way to the commemoration, became an even stronger instrument for reconciliation. But some Poles also borrowed a leaf from the Putin handbook and started spreading conspiracy theories blaming Russia for the tragic accident. And thus Russia is not the sole perpetrator engaging in the misuse of history for twisted ends, even if it is certainly the most notorious and dangerous one. And neither do all the countries we regard as liberal democracies pass critical scrutiny without remark. And this can be said of the United Kingdom, France, and of former colonial powers in general, which still have difficulties in openly addressing the darkest corners of their colonial wars in Algeria, Kenya, and elsewhere. And even Germany, notwithstanding the praise it has earned for its Vergangenheitsbewältigung, still has stones to turn about its own colonial history. But it has to be added that this has not been, that this has not in any of these countries led to restrictions on revisionist and critical historiography of the kind we have seen in Russia and other states actively engaged in history denial. And I would add that the United States is an open issue in this respect today. We will see what goes on there, but universities have already been targeted. And this is also part of the use of history in Asia, where relations between China, Vietnam, Japan, and the Republic of Korea are still burdened by different historical interpretations of events prior to and during the Second World War. While all of these, like most other countries, also have disputes concerning the writing of teaching of their own national histories, it is China where the nationalist approach is in addressing its own history is most worrying, as the central government has paramount authority in rewriting national history, and its interpretation is promoted through various channels to shape people's national identity. And over the past 2 decades, the ruling party and government have promoted a nationalistic history to promote a Han-dominant Chinese identity. A similarly strong nationalist trend is evident in other countries as well, But even in party-ruled Vietnam, historians have told me that they have no problems when discussing their troubled common history with French or American historians, but not with Chinese. Although I have mentioned present or former great powers as countries where history has been misused for nationalist purposes, we cannot assume that smaller countries are immune to such practices. And this also applies to the use of history in my own country, Finland. History had a central role when Finland's national awareness and state institutions were constructed in the 19th century. And this also led to conflict with Russia, in which different interpretations of history also played a role. There were also internal conflicts concerning the history of our bloody civil war in 1918, and that left deep wounds in our society and took a long time to heal. But on the whole, historians in Finland have been able to play a positive role in dealing with controversial periods of our own history and of our relations with our neighbors, and we are always ready to share our experiences in doing this. And thus, by the turn of the millennium, Finland had more or less reached the happy state where we no longer had any history battles to wage, neither internally nor with our neighbors. But after the Russian attack on Ukraine and our accession to NATO, some Russians adhering to the official line have started to rekindle old historical myths and falsifications of history. While the Finns, as occupiers in East Karelia during the Second World War, were sometimes guilty of improper behavior, this was openly admitted and dealt with after the war, leaving no reason or factual grounds for the kind of shameful Russian attempts to present the victims of Stalin's purges lying in mass graves in Karelia as victims of the Finnish occupiers. Those in Russia who oppose and expose this kind of blatant falsification of history have also been victimized. One of them, for example, is Yuri Dmitriev, the head of the now banned organization Memorial in Karelia, who was sentenced to 13 years in prison on fabricated charges of child sex, but in reality for his work in locating and exhuming mass graves of people killed during Stalin's rule. When regimes change, this almost inevitably leads to some purges and rewriting of history. And when dictators and dictatorships fall, it is understandable and to some extent also necessary that the statues and monuments erected in their honor also fall. This leads me to, as a side comment, to note that I think that Skopje leads the world's record in statues per square mile. Maybe our Macedonian friends can comment on this. All regime changes will also entail a close scrutiny of the individual responsibility that supporters and officials of the previous regime had for any crimes committed. And this kind of lustration has been done in very different ways, from summary executions and show trials to long drawn out legal processes and truth commissions. Communist and fascist takeovers have usually been followed by the former methods. Democratic changes have at least tried to do better, but many still ongoing processes and recurring crisis situations in former dictatorships are evidence of the many difficulties and challenges this entails. Post-regime challenge situations will always create a demand for the work of historians. And while historians should be ready to make their knowledge, experience, and research results available to those directly engaged in these processes, historians should avoid becoming institutional parts of them, much less take any role resembling that of a judge. Let history and historians judge is a good and correct slogan, but the judgments passed by history and historians should not have any direct links or dependence on formal judicial processes. A regime change, whatever the viciousness of the former regime, should not and cannot entail erasing history or the eradication of all the very concrete marks and monuments the ancien regime has left. A cultured approach to historical monuments should leave an environment where traces of all our history, the more unpalatable and unsavory parts of it included, can be studied. And as time passes, they can be regarded as historical relicts which need not unduly bother future generations, but will serve as focal points in understanding our past. And I think that nobody would think of demanding that the ruins of the Colosseum in Rome should be demolished because people were tortured and killed there in gladiator games. This kind of respect and comprehension is even more needed when these relics may still arouse contradictory memories, feelings, and passions among different groups of the population. Memorials to those who have lost their lives in wars and conflicts should be, and usually are, respected, irrespective of the nationality of the victims. So while it is relatively easy to make clear what the role of politics and politicians vis-à-vis history should not be, historical truths and interpretations of history should not be made into legislative issues. And while Russia today may be the worst example of this, we could also question the way in which Holocaust denial has been criminalized in some countries. And there are also countries where legislation is to be found on how to, which terminology to use regarding historical events and so on. And as a historian, I have very little understanding of this kind of judicial control. And as desirable and important as it is that politicians should have an adequate knowledge and understanding of history so as to be able to address historical issues, they should not do it by resorting to legislation. Their task is to see to it that historical research is adequate research and that it can be carried out freely without governmental guidance. This does not rule out politics identifying issues and items where research is needed, nor establishing and funding specific research projects. A good example of this is the project carried out in Finland on all our war deaths between 1914 and 1922, which produced valuable information and enhanced understanding. Politicians should also see to it that historians have unlimited and open access to all historical archives, documents, and other sources. I have warned about politicians who abuse history for different purposes in a way which upholds and deepens confrontations or even causes hostilities between peoples and countries. Unfortunately, there is nothing that would a priori exclude the possibility that historians, like any other professional group, would not lend their knowledge and expertise to abusive purposes. Examples are to be found of historians who have been party to this kind of abuse, either as initiators or when pandering to the powers that be. And I will not exhaust you with a long list of examples for this. We can, with good reason, criticize the many countries and their leaders, as well as the historians who lend themselves to the nationalist and confrontation-seeking use of history. While these historians are a minority, the works of any historian can be quoted and misused. And that is why it is extremely important to engage in dialogue with all historians as researchers with the aim of encouraging and supporting the possibilities for independent and critical historical research transcending borders, so that historians could also be contributors to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. And such work does not finish with peace agreements which put an end to a conflict. Neglect of post-conflict aftercare leads easily to a renewal of the conflict. And aftercare also calls for writing the history of the conflict in a way which all parties can live with. And we can well imagine how challenging this is, for example, when writing a common history for Cyprus, not to mention how to write Middle Eastern history if and when a lasting peace can be made between Israel and Palestine. The use and abuse of history is an issue which I had discussed already for many years as Minister for Foreign Affairs with historians, scholars of international relations, diplomats and politicians in Finland and countless other countries. My vision for how international cooperation between historians could actively and systematically be used for conflict prevention, resolution and mediation has been met everywhere very positively. And encouraged by this reception in June 2015, a large number of Finnish historians responded positively to the invitation to a meeting to discuss the issue. And at the end of the discussions, we decided to establish an NGO called Historians Without Borders in Finland. And according to the statutes of Historians Without Borders, the aim of the organization is to promote and deepen general and comprehensive knowledge and understanding of history, promote open and free access to historical materials and archives, promote interactive dialogue between different views and interpretations of history to bring closer diverging views of the course of historical events, support efforts to impede the abuse of history to foster conflicts or to sustain enemy images and distorted myths, and to contribute to the use of history in diffusing conflicts and in conflict resolution. So this is in our statutes. And we wanted to make our initiative into an international project, and together with the University of Helsinki, the Finnish Institute for International Affairs and other partners, we arranged an international conference on the use and abuse of history in conflicts at the University of Helsinki in 2016. And at the end of the conference, the several hundred participants from all over the world agreed on a declaration establishing the International Network of Historians Without Borders. And you have been distributed this declaration, and it can be read like about all of our activities on our website, historianswithoutborders.fi. We are not yet an international organization. We are still a network with an international coordinating committee, which is the Finnish NGO acting as its secretariat. Our network can easily be accessed and joined through accessing the website. And in our work at Historians Without Borders, we have sought to diffuse the misuse of history in conflicts by bringing together historians from parties to a conflict in a dialogue with each other on how to understand and deal with their common history. Aside from many meetings and discussion events with historians, not only in Europe, but also in Africa, Asia, and North America, we have also arranged, inter alia, a conference on colonial history in South Africa with European and African historians, and a conference with historians from all the Nordic countries and Belarus in Sweden. And we have also plans to continue history dialogues with historians in South Africa and Namibia in the autumn. The first step in any attempt to remove history as a source of conflict is to get historians from both sides to sit down together and begin by listening to each other's narratives of their historical relations. Listening to the other side's narrative does not entail accepting it, and it can be contested, but awareness and recognition of those narratives is always the first step towards removing history as a source of conflict. And in this spirit, we have managed twice before Russia's full-scale attack against Ukraine to bring together Ukrainian and Russian historians in Helsinki in closed seminars. While the participants did not agree on very much, They on both sides wanted us to continue facilitating this kind of dialogue. But for obvious reasons, this has not been possible after 2022. But we have received indications from both sides that they would want us to continue this exercise once it once again becomes possible. The two occasions on which I have earlier had the opportunity to address historians at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow and tell them about the principles and work of Historians Without Borders left me with a clear impression that the majority of the profession in Russia shares our aims. But we are all aware of how the honest and open study and teaching of history is not, to put it mildly, encouraged in Russia today. On the contrary, it can seriously imperil the health and freedom of those historians who would want to continue practicing it in Russia. And this has led to a situation where Russian historians are increasingly opting for exile in other European countries, some with official refugee status and others in de facto the same position. We should, as historians in the countries hosting them, engage them in dialogues for laying the groundwork for an open and honest Russian Vergangenheitsbewältigung process once it one day becomes possible in Russia itself. And this is the background for the History in Exile dialogue on Russian memory and history politics in the Nordic and Baltic countries, a project which we started to promote dialogue between historians and history teachers in the Nordic countries and Baltic countries, as well as the public, and engaging these Russian exiles in this process. The focus is on Russian memory and history politics and implications for its historical research in Russian society. And for this project, we have received funding from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and just last week we received a second batch of funding so we can continue this project after the first stage ends now in the summer. And the History in Exile project, with meetings and public events in 2024 and 2025, also aims to highlight the experiences of historians and history teachers of Russian background on the challenges of researching and teaching history in Russia. The project contributes to the networking among all historians and history teachers working at the intersection of history, memory, policy making, and Russian and Eastern European studies. While we are primarily engaged with historians in the Nordic and Baltic countries, we also welcome the participation in the project of both Russian and other historians focusing on Russian history in other countries. And we are hopeful that we can continue as part of this project already in autumn in Berlin with historians based in Germany, both German historians and Russians living there. Their project will promote critical discussions on the use and misuse of historical narratives in authoritarian regimes, particularly in Russia, while fostering open research and knowledge sharing among historians and educators with Russian backgrounds. It will also explore how neglecting sensitive historical issues in democratic societies can lead to memory policy abuse or to the creation of enemy images. The project also aims at laying the groundwork for future cooperation between Russian and international historians, encouraging open and honest appraisal of Russia's history and its relations with other countries. By promoting dialogue between Russian and non-Russian historians, we aim to create the conditions for a shared view of history. Our project partners in Sweden and Estonia are the Swedish Historical Society and the Estonian History and Civic Teachers Associations. Other partners include the Alexander Institute of the University of Helsinki and Euroclio, the European Association of History Educators. To deal openly and honestly with a country's history is never easy, and sometimes, in some places, impossible. And even when governments do not seek to guide how history should be written, it is still true that each country, all countries, have strong built-in propensities to look at their own history from a very nationalist viewpoint. And this is where it is vital that historians look and study history also with historians from other countries, and particularly with those from their neighboring countries. So Historians Without Borders is always ready to engage in dialogues with historians anywhere. And should there be interest in any country to establish a national branch of Historians Without Borders based on the principles stated in our founding declaration, we are ready to offer our support and advice. Historians in many countries, such as presently in Spain, Sweden, Estonia, and Germany, are considering this step. There are also many existing organizations with different names who subscribe to the same principles, and we are keen to be in contact with them as well. And we welcome the possibility to initiate such a dialogue with historians in North Macedonia as well. And hopefully, once we have a credible number of these organizations, at least a dozen countries, we can start making Historians Without Borders from a network into an international organization. Thank you.